Hello there, and welcome to Conversations in Color. My name is Ed Hudgins, and I'm so glad that you are joining us this evening. We're going to focus on the idea of defunding the police and that kind of that catchphrase or that hashtag, defund the police. And we want to kind of unpack that statement and talk about the good in it, the harm in it, how it's applicable, where it's applicable, what it even means. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. But before we dive in too far, I want to talk a little bit about what this Conversations in Color thing is. And really, we are here to provide a space for us to have hard conversations and talk about difficult things, and to do so in a way that is non-threatening and honors these three pillars that we hold on to in our conversations. One is humanity, recognizing the dignity in every human being. And we're not going to demean anybody. Nobody gets vilified. None of that stuff. We also care, obviously, about being honest. That's the second pillar, is honesty. So we're going to lean in and ask hard questions, and we're going to talk about hard stuff, and we're not going to shy away from those things. And then lastly, and also I would say equally importantly, is humility, recognizing that we don't know nearly as much as we think we know half the time, and we are all broken and frail human beings, and we miss a lot of the detail a lot of the time. So those are the three things that we will focus on. And before we get into talking about defunding the police, and before I introduce you to our esteemed panelist for this evening, I have somebody else I want to introduce you to. And her name is Selika Ducksworth-Lawton. She is our resident panelist. She is brilliant. President, yes, you can shake your head all you want, but everybody knows. She is the president of Uniting Bridges. She is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire and involved in all kinds of things with the university. And she is my partner in crime as well. We cause a lot of trouble together. So, Selika, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I see myself more as the head kibitzer and occasional trouble stirrer, that's all. Usually I'm pretty good.
Yes. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight. I'm really excited. We've got Sheriff Ron Cramer here with us. Ron has been with the Sheriff's Office for 45 years, so that's pretty impressive. Been Sheriff since 1996 and has been leading the West Central Drug Task Force since 1990. Welcome, Ron. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for the invite tonight.
Absolutely. We've got Chief Matt Rokus from the Eau Claire Police Department. He's been with the department for 23 years and has been chief since just December of last year. So, Chief Rokus, Matt, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here this evening.
And then we've got Chief Eric Atkinson from the Menominee Police Department. He's been in the role for 8 years and has some teaching experience, from what I understand, at UW Stout and UW River Falls as well. Thank you, Eric, for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And then lastly, but certainly not least, I need to introduce another partner in crime, Mr. Adam Akala. I have been mispronouncing his name, and he graciously corrected me earlier, so I appreciate that. Adam works with CoLab here in Eau Claire, and he's going to be moderating our chat. So if you're joining us via the Pablo Center's streaming platform, there's a chat functionality in there, and you can chat with us. If you right-click Adam's name in the chat function, you can direct message any questions or comments you have that you don't feel comfortable posting in the public forum. But otherwise, feel free to post in the public forum and the chat functionality there. And over the course of the show, we will interject questions and comments from the community, from you guys who are listening, as they fit within the flow of our conversation. Now, before we get into defunding the police, I have to ask you all the most important question we will ask all night. And Selika, I'll start with you. What is something you've done which embarrasses you?
Oh, God. Before I answer that, I do have to disclose I am on the Eau Claire Police and Fire Commission, so people should know.
But you're not embarrassed about that, right?
I'm not embarrassed about that.
Make sure.
What?
Do you need a moment? Because I can give one for me. I probably should have done that.
You do one for you. Let me think.
All right. So back when I was a teenager and I was in my church youth group, I did dumb things on occasion, to like impress my friends or just general stupidity. And one of the things that I did, we had a bus and we took the bus to this event, and I decided that it would be cool for me to like run over the seats on the bus to try to beat everybody up to the front of the bus. Well, at some point, one of my friends, maybe I'm using that term loosely at this point, but one of my friends tripped me, and I went head first in between two of the seats, and my body somehow, and I was a bigger boy then than I am now, so you can imagine what a sight this would have been, sunk down in between these two seats to where I ended up getting stuck underneath this. This is an old school bus, and I got stuck underneath the seats in the school bus. And eventually I had to like wiggle my way all the way up to the front of the bus underneath the seats in the school bus and try to figure out a way to get out. Eventually, obviously I got out because I'm here, but that was not one of my finer moments in life. So probably it's good for me if I'm going to ask you guys to reveal something about yourself that is somewhat embarrassing. I should probably lead off. So Selika, do you have something in mind?
Yeah, my husband skateboards. My daughter skateboards. I tried to let them teach me how to skateboard. I think there's a video that I need to delete off a phone somewhere. It was not a pretty sight, and it was not a successful endeavor. And they remind me of it whenever they feel I need to be humbled.
So is it possible we could post that video in the chat?
No.
Function? Okay. Checking.
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. Ron, how about you?
Well, I'm going to go back to high school in a locker room with the basketball team in the junior varsity sitting there, and I was wearing this ugly hat that my JV coach actually had the similar hat, and I was chewing them out like the coach would, and he walked in and caught me.
Nice.
I didn't play for a couple of weeks. I used to start, and I was benched, and I got caught, and and everybody knew it.
Yeah, I've been in situations like that. I feel that pain.
Yeah.
Matt, how about you?
Well, we're here talking a little bit about policing tonight, so maybe I'll share a police story if you don't mind. Early on in my career, I was working the Eau Claire 4th of July fireworks event. So if you're familiar with the Carson Park fireworks, we've got 10 to 15,000 people pack into Carson Park, and then when the fireworks are over, everybody leaves at the same time. And so I was directing traffic by myself, the intersection of 5th Avenue and Lake Street, which is a very busy intersection. And it was my responsibility there, so I'm directing traffic, and two cars run right into each other and have an accident. Nobody's hurt. It wasn't based necessarily on the direction I was giving them, but I have two cars stuck together in the middle of the intersection. It's the 4th of July.
July 4th.
On July 4th, it's like 90-some degrees and extremely hot, and the squad car I had back then was an early 90s Crown Victoria, and you had to pop the hood on them so they wouldn't overheat. And it was parked there so long, the engine then started on fire. So there I am in the middle of one of the busiest intersections in Eau Claire with 10,000 people traveling through with my squad car on fire and two cars stuck together there. And my wife was riding along that night and got to see her husband in action. So.
That is a bummer all the way around.
It was.
Well, Eric, can you top that? I mean,
We don't have all night to talk about all the things that have been embarrassing, so I'm gonna pick just one this time, and this is a work story as well. I was very early in my career. I pulled someone over and had them on the side of the road. They were there for speeding, and I had every intention to write them a ticket. Now, to set the stage, this was in February. It was very icy, snow on the road and on the side, and there's an extended ditch because this is just off of the interstate. And so, trying to be the safe, responsible young officer I was at the time, I was going to go along the passenger side so I didn't get hit by a car or put the driver at risk if they needed to get out. Well, as I go to deliver said ticket, it was so icy, I slid about 20 feet down into the gore, slammed my back onto the ground into the ice. I must have made a noise of some kind because the driver got out of the car, came over and said, "Are you okay?" As I'm way down the hill, and because I had the air knocked out of me, I'm like, "I'm fine." And he goes, "Is that a ticket?" I'm like, "You can just go. It's okay. I'll take care of it." And I ripped it up. So one of the many times of embarrassing myself. So that's part of the reason why I'm not a professional athlete. It's hard to stay upright just trying to do the job.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that.
I might be able to top that one.
I'm not gonna let you though, because we got business to attend to, and we can talk after, you know.
Oh yeah.
So, it's important. The reason I ask a silly question like that is, like, you know, we're all human beings sitting here together. We've all got emotions. We've all got thoughts. We've all got family, friend groups. You know, like just real people. We've all done dumb stuff. We've clearly demonstrated that in our stories. Although, Matt, I'm not sure yours, you really did a whole lot that was dumb. That was a series of unfortunate events. And so as we dive into the things we want to talk about tonight, I think it's just really important for each of us and then for everybody who's listening or watching via live stream to just recognize the common humanity that we have here together. And so with that in mind, I kind of want to start because the whole defund the police thing really came into the public eye or ear, if you will, in response to the killing of George Floyd over in Minneapolis on Memorial Day. And so before we get into talking specifically about the defund the police and that whole idea and whatever, I'd like to, if we could, just take a moment and talk about what it was like for you as an officer of the law and as a human being to see the video of what happened with George Floyd with Officer Chauvin over in Minneapolis. And so I guess, Eric, would you mind, since you're closest to me, would you mind and kind of just share?
Sure. I had a variety of emotions, really, when I saw that video. One, just the shock of that taking place. Two, it was supposed to be, it's a police officer in my profession, and seeing that happen was appalling. And then thinking he needs to go to prison. Mm. And then the devastation of it, that this is going to create just what I thought this is going to be a tidal wave of issues. And so it was a mixed bag of emotions. Yeah. And it started a tremendous amount of conversations in our community, inside of our department. And not one person I talked to thought that any part of that was okay. Mm. And that includes officers as well. And I think if people look at that and say, well, that's not so bad, they should really take a look in the mirror and realize that that is absolutely not anything of what we should stand for. And that should not represent anything in law enforcement. And swift action needs to be taken to make sure that that doesn't happen. And of course, it's caused a variety of protests, some riots, all sorts of things, and some negative things. But what I'm hoping for that comes out of this, wherever there's a challenge or a problem, it creates opportunities. Mm. And I think this is going to create opportunities for discussion, measured response, and change that is needed in areas to improve the quality of service. And so it's, at least for me, it's impacted me on a variety of different levels. Yeah. As a human being, it's appalling. As a professional, disgusted. And moving forward, I hope that we can all do better and work together to do better.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, it had a profound effect, and it still does. It's something I think about. That incident on that street in Minneapolis is something that I still think about quite a bit as you look at it. Looking at it as a police officer and as someone that's dedicating my professional career to this, it just caused me to ask how could this happen, but not naive to the fact, knowing that this does happen in communities. It has happened and continues to in communities around the country. And so kind of that profound personal effect that this is wrong, this is not okay, the lack of humanity that we saw, and being in the position that I'm in the community, as once we moved on from that a little bit, how do we move on from this, and how do we fix this, and how do we change as a community and as a police department to make sure that this doesn't happen? Because we can look at that isolated incident, or that incident, as an isolated incident, or we can also, and I think the more appropriate look at this is that this is the reality in many communities throughout the country. And while I do think Eau Claire is different, what's happening in other places and other communities creates a perception about policing and the quality of life in our community, and how we measure our success as a community, and how we measure the community looks at the effectiveness of the police department, that it should be a partner and serve them, and it takes away our ability to do that. So. Yeah. It was sickening, it was emotional, but it's, I think also for many of us in this profession or in this community, it's been a galvanizing moment to really motivate us to take responsibility and take the necessary steps.
Thank you. Thank you. Ron, how about you?
Well, I sit on the Training and Standards Board for the state of Wisconsin, and like Matt, I hope that people looking at that incident don't paint law enforcement as we're all bad. We've got to change the complexion in community policing. How we work with the community is totally different here in western Wisconsin. I get to work undercover for 6 years and see policing in different counties. One of the biggest things is the training issue. What that officer did is not trained. What the other officers tried to do is tell him, let's turn him over, and they didn't. There's more to the story. We know that these two people, the officer and George Floyd, probably worked together at a club, and that officer has some other complications now because of tax evasion that came out while they were investigating. So again, as a police officer, he wasn't following the rules, policy, procedure. And again, you take a look at videos like that and saying, that will never happen in our community. We'll train our officers, and we'll talk about those issues, like Matt said, and we'll talk about it in service, and we'll remind the officers to be sensitive. You know, you got to de-escalate a lot of the situations that we run into, and we do a lot of training in that area. So again, George Floyd had a number of run-ins with police. One video is of him and 16 years old being on a Judge Judy, where he actually hijacked a car from a lady in Chicago and crashed the car, and his reasoning for crashing the car is, the police made me do it. Well, he didn't take responsibility for that action, but he had action with the police before and probably had a negative thoughts about how we do our job policing. So again, you know, we tell people that, you know, when you get pulled over, if we're doing a search warrant, comply. There's another day that's going to follow. If we do something wrong by policy, procedure, there's another day that we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think, and Selika, I'll lean on you here in a second. Thank you, Ron. One of the things I think is we probably need to walk through a little bit, and I think it will segue really well into the Defund the Police overall discussion here, is what was done to George Floyd, whether he, you know, whatever criminal record he had leading into that, or whatever background he might have had going into that, really didn't matter at that point. You know, when you know, as I watched the video of Officer Chauvin's knee on his neck for 8 minutes, it's like I don't really care what he did, even 15 minutes before, to be honest with you. You know, it doesn't matter to me. And so I think there's on the one hand, you've got the action of the police officer, and then you've got whatever background George Floyd brought into it. And I think they're two separate things in this conversation. But Selika, I'm guessing you might want to shed a little light on it as well.
Well, George Floyd is a working class or middle class black person's nightmare. Because we look at the video and all the video edits show he was complying. And you combine that with the Elijah McCain, which happened about a week later, and it becomes, okay, we comply and we still get killed. And if you're black here in this country, there's a set of social media. There's a whole Tumblr that is devoted to police brutality. When I train people at CVTC, when I do the cultural competency, I show them some of it. And they're sort of shocked that you can see this. There's all this video. So there have been times, I'm thinking of the psychiatrist in Florida who was laying down with his hands up, still got shot. The Philando Castile case is also very close to our minds because many middle-class black people who are gun owners here refuse to get the concealed carries because we're afraid of becoming Philando Castile. He did everything right. People keep trying to say he didn't to excuse it, but he did. Now, I know from the work I do with the military, the work I do with history, that the more training an officer has, the less implicit bias they have, the less likely they are to do something like this. And we know that 3rd Precinct didn't train the way they were supposed to. They were taking killology training. They didn't do any of the other standard training they were supposed to, and the union protected that. But when I look at George Floyd and then I hear somebody saying, oh, well, he should have just complied, and I'm not picking on you for that, because I've taught my son put your wallet on the dashboard, put your hand here, just live through it because you can sue afterwards. And my son is over 6 feet. I worry that that's not enough, that he will hit running between here and the other side of the state where he's in engineering school. He will hit the wrong officer who's only going to see this. And that was what George Floyd was for a lot of us. It was the wrong officer. It didn't matter what he was going to do. That officer had a wild hair and decided to kill somebody that day. And that, if you were a scapegoated minority in America, it's humongously frightening. It's terrifying. And it's even more terrifying that there are some people in the majority here who don't understand why we're terrified, if that makes sense, and why we would need some reassurance that multicultural people in the Chippewa Valley are not going to be scapegoated in the same way, not going to be treated in the same way, and not going to be falsely accused or mistaken the same way. Does this make sense?
Total sense. Yeah. Perfect sense.
So George Floyd, I think John L. Lewis said that Emmett Till was the George Floyd of his generation. And I think George Floyd was really a turning point for a lot of people, if that makes sense. Because to watch that is really to watch a nightmare.
It is.
No question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, part of what we have to talk about is like the whole dynamic of isolated incidents versus systemic problems. That's part of the issue. And as we have seen various news stories, you talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. You can go down the list of things that we've come aware of in the last few years. And I think this is where the Defund the Police rallying cry is coming from, because I think more and more non-black folks are seeing these realities for what they are. I know my own personal story. I grew up, or it's not even about when I grew up, but in my adult life, I would hear stories from the cities, not just the Twin Cities, but cities, about black folks who are being harassed by the police or killed by the police, and for me it was like, I've never seen that. That doesn't. How can that be real? I've never seen police behave that way. And then the videos start showing up. And it's like, you can't really deny what you're seeing right there. And then, and I've talked about this before. Then I brought my son home, he's black. He's 11 years old. He's from Ethiopia, and to hear how he's been treated at school and such, words he's been called and such. It's like, okay, so I need to, first of all, like, repent for the way I've been ignoring my black brothers and sisters, and like, recognize there's a problem here, and we got to figure out what is at the root of the problem. And so, I think for a lot of folks, the Defund the Police rallying cry, is an important. It's an important rallying cry. It's an important thing to stand on and say, hey, there's got to be fundamental change. But we need to, in this forum, talk about what that even means, the whole idea of defunding the police, and even if it makes any kind of sense. And so, Selika, I would like to lean on you a little bit. If you could just give us, a working definition of what we mean when we talk about, or what protesters mean when they talk about defunding the police, that would be really helpful.
Well, protesters, when they're talking about defunding the police, are really talking about our large urban police departments and some of the smaller ones where there is systematic corruption, where they do not feel like they're served. Where in Milwaukee, the two young girls who should have been Amber Alerted were not, and the community felt moved to create vigilante justice because they feel that on one hand, they get petty revenue tickets and they are harassed, but on the other hand, they do not feel that the police protect them or serve them. So their question really, and that, Defund the Police came out of Minneapolis, and it really came out of that 3rd precinct. And it was the idea, if they're going to send 70 officers over to Chauvin's house and just let people terrorize our neighborhood, and we have to create small militias to protect it, what are we paying for? And if we have to break these union contracts, how do we do it? So it really came out of that specific conversation and then moved into police are being used today to do things that they would not have been asked to do in the 1970s or even the 1980s. The police and the jail are our default answer to mental health, our default answer to the problems of drugs, the problems of parenting, to the problems of this new mobile situation. So these people are looking at that, and they're looking at the revenue that we're using, that we're paying, in these big departments, and going, we could put that somewhere else. We should be paying for mental health. We should be paying for all these other things. There are also some people who are arguing, when you look at a department like Milwaukee that's been very resistant to reform, or my home state, New Orleans, and they've terrorized the community so much that the DA has to jail witnesses. Nobody wants to cooperate with the police. 10 years ago, a woman who was an anti-drug crusader was killed by an assassin who turned out to be an off-duty police officer in the pay of one of the major drug cartels. So there's no trust. There's no trust at all from the community to those kinds. And you look at 77th Precinct, where again you had police officers in the pay of drug cartels who were terrorizing the community, but they weren't protecting it. They're not thinking of departments like here. But I'll be honest, let me be really honest here. For some of them, they can't even imagine a department like here. I was on the phone with some of my ACLU counterparts in Milwaukee and talking about, well, we did this and we did that, and I worked with Chief Rokus, and I talked with Chief Rokus, and we worked out a security plan, and I was on the phone with him. And they're like, what? You mean he like talked to you? And I said, yes. And well, did his lieutenants listen to him? Well, yeah. And his officers listened to him? Yes. And they didn't bring out riot gear on you? No, they had polo shirts on. I want you to understand, these people I had to send them video. They had never seen nor could even conceive of that kind of behavior, because the police in Milwaukee are so hostile that they have to be forced to work with it. And because I'm on the ACLU board, we've got like 4 consent decrees against them, and they were still not obeying them. But that's a department that's trained in a pseudo-military, and I say that because the military doesn't do it, called killology, where they don't see themselves as serving, protecting. They see themselves as occupying and dominating. They think they're the thin blue line against the apocalypse. And they see the entire black community as suspects. And we get people who come up here, and I'm going to quote my husband, and my husband said to me, Selika, this is the only time I've been in a police department in the city where the police treated me with respect. And my mother said this police department was the first time she'd ever had somebody call her ma'am and be polite to her. So I think that when you get people who haven't had that experience, they don't even know y'all exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for some people to understand. So defund the police. You know, especially when people use defund the police and say they want to destroy the carceral state or they want to dismantle all police departments, it's because they're looking at these big urban departments, and some of the small ones, I'm thinking of Ahmaud Arbery, where they did dissolve that department because the corruption in that department was so bad that I think the feds went in a week later after those guys were arrested and arrested the sheriff and like 5 deputies for stealing money. They disbanded the department because you can't fix some things. So they're looking at that, but they don't have a frame of reference for dealing with what we have up here.
I think that's an important point, and so I want to hear what you guys have to say about just some of those nuances that Selika is alluding to. When you hear, and also just, you know, as an officer of the law, and you hear the idea of defunding the police, what is that? I mean, I'm not saying like the first time you heard it and you haven't had a chance to think about it. I'm saying even now you've had a chance to process certain things about it or whatever. Like, what is that? Where do you land on that? What does that feel like for you as an officer of the law?
Well, the emotional response is when you hear that is, hey, that's not who we are. Why the Eau Claire Police Department? That's kind of the initial emotional reaction. As you back up and think about it a little bit, though, and are reflective, and if you look at things fairly, you recognize what Dr. Ducksworth-Lawton just talked about and the lived experience that many others have had, and the inappropriate, sometimes criminal actions that the police have engaged in. And you have to have that kind of willingness to kind of understand that and realize that even though that's not part of our experience in Eau Claire or who we want to be as a police department, that's out there and that exists. And that mere existence creates kind of barriers for some of the relationship building and strength building that we want to engage in at the Eau Claire Police Department. So we want to strengthen trust. We want to build those relationships with community members and strengthen those relationships with our community members of color. We have a hard time with it sometimes, though, because we really haven't earned the trust within that community to kind of break down those barriers. We have to work a little harder for it. We're willing to do that. And so, I mean, that's, I think, the way it should be, part of it, the way you feel when you hear it. That's not us. But I do think the proper way of looking at it, it's like, all right, what do we need to do to kind of at least talk a little bit more about who we are, what our policing philosophy is, and who we want to be as an organization, that commitment to continual improvement we have, but simultaneously stopping and listening, because I'm from a small community in central Wisconsin, so my lived experience is very different. So I have to take the time to educate myself and listen to others, and get our officers in the mindset that they need to understand that lived experience as well, so we can build those relationships that we need to, so we can deal with this, and we need to deal with.
To acquire resources to help themselves. And so at first it almost feels like a personal attack to take away the defund, like it's like, what, we don't represent that. When you take a step back and look at it, we need to be able to do better and use evidence-based approaches that are proven to have effective outcomes, not just outputs. Mm-hmm. In order to help people. Mm-hmm. And where I think a lot of that trust comes in that the doctor is speaking of, you've had communities of color that have experienced law enforcement much different ways, and this is going generations back to the southern states of slave patrols to after Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War. People are moving to northern cities, but you still have Jim Crow laws, you still have segregation. Who was there to enforce that? It was law enforcement that was used to enforce it. And then as you move forward in history, you get to the civil rights movement to create the equality. Then you get the equality, but then you have a lack of equity. And you're having different applications of law enforcement services being applied into communities. And a lot of times they're poor socioeconomic status and communities of color. Experience over policing, and at that time it was the thing to do. How do we take care of this? We're going to arrest people. We're going to put them in jail. That's how we're going to fix the crime. Well, what we really need to be looking at is, one, taking an approach to crime and social disorder in more of a harm reduction or public health standpoint, getting to the root causes of what causes crime, working with communities and other experts to be able to accomplish that, because oftentimes law enforcement has the first contact with these folks. And the criminal justice system, jails like the sheriff's jail, prisons, they're not places for folks. And if we can get with them and the right resources early on, we're going to find crime will be lowered. We'll have better outcomes for our communities. That, to me, is where the defunding police is. And then I think for those of us who didn't grow up in the inner cities, is to understand what are some of the experiences, not just perceptions, but realities that people have encountered and why they have that distrust, and to build up on it. And it is such a complicated problem, such a complicated issue. It is going to require more things than just saying, hey, we got to cut 50% out of your budget and do that. We want to make sure that we have measured responses to these issues, so we just don't have knee-jerk issues or unintended outcomes that we've had in the past, like we're going to find people and we'll make the bad guys pay for our stuff, like the revenue. Ferguson Police Department, in their study, that was what was found taking place. And it was there to offset taxes, and they figured, well, if these folks are causing the crime or problem, they can pay for it. Well, if you're applying all these fines to people who are poor, they're being impacted in communities of color, they're never going to get out of that cycle. And nobody wants to take a look at those things and really take a look at what we've done or what we thought was the right thing and realize that they had a tremendous amount of impact, and this has been happening for generations.
Yeah.
So whatever defunding policing may look like to other people or how we allocate those resources, we should be very measured and careful on how we do that. We should also make sure that we have a partnership with the community, so that way we have a solid understanding that if we're going to do this, these things may happen, and we need to study those outcomes. So as far as reform or progressive or altering the way we do business, defunding police, I'm all for reform that has the right kind of outcomes we're trying to have. I just don't want to do things just to say we did things.
Yes.
And I'm worried that we may be going down that road in some communities.
So you're talking about having a more strategic, evidence-based approach to...
Absolutely. That is where it needs to go. I do believe change needs to happen. It is necessary, and we need to reconcile these problems that have been happening not just for the last few years, but hundreds of years, how we can get past that and build trust with communities, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and everybody wants the same thing. They want a safe community, they want an equal chance at opportunities, and they want to make sure that it is equitably distributed.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, what it sounds like, what I'm hearing you say, and I think this resonates with me, is when we talk about defunding the police, what we really are talking about is reallocating funds, more so than we're just going to take all your money away. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That is what I'm getting at, and you take a look at when you're talking about the funds for it. So let's just take like substance use disorders. Defunding police, oftentimes we're one of the first points of contact. Either they may have an overdose, or they're engaging in suspicious activity, or there's some kind of complaint. You respond to the person's house or their location. You determine, okay, there's not a crime that's being committed here. What is the real issue? Is this person, maybe they're an alcoholic, they're addicted to methamphetamine, they got an opiate addiction, cocaine addiction, what have you. Where I would like to see policing move to, and some communities have done it, and we're getting to those places, but you partner with counselors, addiction coaches, those sorts of personnel. You have pre-arrest deflection and diversion programs where you have intervention teams. They're made up of an officer, a medic, or a counselor that helps get them to treatment. So the defunding, if let's say you're taking resources away from the police and money away from the police, you're just going to get, you ultimately at the end of the day will get bare bones response of what you're statutorily required. What I would like to see is money put aside, either one, to hire social workers, counselors, and these specialists. Either you can embed them in police departments if you want, or you can certainly provide more funding to like Health and Human Services as well, so they can partner with law enforcement.
Yep.
So they can build it. And I talk forever, so I'm sorry. One of the last things that I really worry about when you're taking people or law enforcement away from the responses or responding to some of these things, how are police going to learn to build trust, do better, and improve their community if you're separating them away from the community? And the only time that police will respond is if someone has a gun or some major crime has taken place.
Wrong. Yep.
It does not repair that trust.
Right. And hey, I'm a quality assurance manager by day.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, and we don't want the only time our frontline agents to hear from us is when they did something wrong.
Absolutely.
You know,
I agree. I would agree with you.
I get that. Ron, we haven't given you a chance to kind of respond to this whole thing we're talking about now with defunding the police.
Well, first of all, I want to tell people the sheriff's not responsible for everybody in the jail. There's probable cause that ends up having people come to our facility. the district attorney filing charges, probation parole for probation holds. Some of these people have been convicted of criminal offenses and now are being held accountable for they failed on probation. Alcohol, drug addiction plays into it. Right now, Eau Claire County is $3.3 million over in human services, $39 million going to about 16,000 people. Some of those people are in different programs in human services. And when people talk about defunding the police, in this next year's budget, 2021, they're talking about taking 5% from all of the departments in the county because there's only a certain amount of tax dollars that go around. So that means I've got to come up with $600,000 in our budget. That means less police, means less deputy sheriffs. We're running a jail with close to 300 people. We're assisting the court and bailiff, civil process, 19 patrol people, and we're assisting in other police departments in Eau Claire County, Augusta, Fairchild, Altoona, as backup. So it makes it pretty difficult when I hear people say, let's defund the sheriff's department, and it's at a 5%, $600,000. That's a major impact. There's some services that we're going to have to quit doing. We used to do the DARE program in all the Eau Claire school district for many years, and we had to cut back on that because the county was asking for cuts department-wide in every department throughout the county in order to make a budget. The tax dollars only go so far.
Right.
Half of our budget, $13 million, is spent on the jail, and as I was talking to Selika earlier, when we built out that jail, the fourth cell pod that never got built out was going to be our honor block. That was going to be the block that we're going to work with people to try to transition them back to the community. As a county jail, we've never been a correction facility. We haven't had the resources. We've tried to get human services to come in. We've tried to get more mental health. I have a full-time nurse, a mental health nurse, and a part-time. And with that $600,000 cut, one of the things is the part-time mental health nurse would have to go away, which this is a community issue. And I'm glad we're here sitting talking about it because there's not enough space in the Leader Telegram to talk about the issue. We have to sit in a forum and talk. I went on talk radio, one of our local, and I love going on the talk radio to explain what's going on in the community. As my wife won't take me to the grocery store anymore because it takes 45 minutes to an hour, and she's left me there before. But that's the time on the one-on-one. I had a lady say, well, you're building a new jail. I'm not going to vote for you anymore. So I took time to tell her what the needs are of the community. And then she understood. She goes, well, I've never seen that in the newspaper. There was no forum for us to get that out. We had people talking, no jail downtown. And I asked a couple of people who were carrying protest signs, where do you think the jail is? I don't know. It's on the third floor of this building that you're protesting. The jail is downtown right now. We had a couple of people walking on the walk path, and they looked, and the one lady said to the other lady, I overheard her say it, what's that building right there? And the lady says, I don't know. I think that's the new library they're building. But it was we wanted to make the jail not look like a jail, obviously, being in a good neighbor. And we made a lot of modifications. The other thing I'd like to touch on is our Criminal Justice Collaborating Council, the chief, myself, the judges, Human Services, the District Attorney's Office, Probation Parole. We've been sitting together for 12 years talking about systems issues. How do we get better at what we're doing? The only way we can get is feedback of what, in particular incidents, and I was telling the doctor that if you have an issue, you've got to let the police chief or the sheriff know so we can look into it, dive into it, do a deep dive into it to see, is it real or is it perceived?
Right.
And on any traffic stop that we make or any crime scene that we go to, if someone has a complaint, you got to reach out to us. Yeah. There's got to be communications in order to solve the problem.
Yeah, I think, yes, I agree with you. And I think, that can be difficult if, depending on the background of the person involved. And what I mean by that is, I have been in contact with black neighbors who have come up from Chicago, for example, where their story of interacting with the police was significantly different than what you might hear in Eau Claire, somebody who was raised in Eau Claire. And so for them to think, oh, I need to go talk to the sheriff about this, probably won't occur to them because they don't have trust, like the trust that Matt was talking about a couple minutes ago. Mm-hmm. So I think the more of these conversations we can have and connection points that don't have to do with there's some kind of conflict, there's some kind of, law breakage or whatever, I think it's really imperative. And I know, Selika, you have something you'd like to add to that.
Well, I want to pick up on Eric's, and please call me Selika. I am not on campus. I don't need to use my title.
Okay, Dr. Lawton.
Segregation is one of the keys with what we're dealing with here. In that you look at Milwaukee and Chicago have traded being the most segregated city in America for, I want to say, the last 10 years. And my home city of New Orleans is very segregated. LA is segregated not just by race and class, but by skin shade. When I'm in South Central, my very light-skinned son sticks out. When we are in Compton, he fits in more. And that is a part of the reason why the police in Milwaukee, the police in Minneapolis seem to have such a hard time letting go of this us versus them mentality. That implicit bias part, because we know that when you group a minority, it trips people's fear thresholds and it causes them more of a fight or flight. That's at the heart of implicit bias. So if you're sending, police officers into this environment that is not just their race, but it's not their class. They're middle class white, they're middle class black, they're middle class Asian. They're dealing with lower class whites, lower class blacks, lower class Asians. They're going to be more likely to stereotype. And segregation in and of itself makes that happen. So I think part of what we're dealing with up here is we have less segregation. But on the other hand, too, for the black community, the fact that the jail has an overage is not well explained to our community as these are not black people who originate in Eau Claire. Because if you take out the people who originate from, say, Chicago and Minneapolis, what would the percentage of blacks in your jail be then?
It'd be a lot lower, and I'm glad you brought that up. I missed the point. Eau Claire's population is 1.9 total of African American color. And someone did a snapshot one day of our jail, and it was 19%. And they want to correlate that to the police are targeting the black community. Well, I told Selika, go on our website. Every name is published that's in our county jail, and compare it to CCAP. It's not their first time, second time, third time they're in our jail. They probably have been criminal histories from Minnesota, criminal histories from Chicago. They were here committing crime, got caught. So the judge put them on a cash bond for the flight risk and for the criminal history that the person had. So again, and they're felony in natures. We don't try to get cash bonds on misdemeanor type people. The average stay in our jail in Eau Claire County, 50% stay less than an average of 2 days. They're out on a signature bond because they're local residents that we know and trust that they'll come back to court. The other problem we have is the probation holds. Those are the ones that they violated their probation. They're going to be either revoked, charged with a new charge, and of course, if they come in there, we don't get paid for those days from the state of Wisconsin under the partnership that they're supposed to reimburse us for every day that some of these folks stay in our facilities. So that goes on the backs of our taxpayers here locally, because nobody's going to pay for it with a new charge. They won't pay for that. No, that was an administrative rule. So again, it's complex.
Yeah. I'll say.
And I want to tell people, if you take a look at and we've got our analysts looking at that of the people of color that are in our jail. They're trying to take a look at where they went to school, where they lived, and did they come here and commit crime. It would be a very low number. Matter of fact, I think we have one Native American and maybe one Asian in our facility. But you take away from the criminality, and we may have a very low population of African American in our facility that born and raised and schooled here in Eau Claire.
One thing has become abundantly clear to me in the last hour, and that's that an hour and a half is not going to be enough time for us to really walk through a lot of this stuff. We have had some really, I think, pointed, strong questions come in from the community, and I think I'd be remiss to not give this some time. So, Adam, would you share with us, maybe we'll go through a few of these questions.
Yeah, Sheriff Kramer, we've got a question from Elizabeth here about the federal funding for high-intensity drug trafficking areas. The Sheriff's Department and Eau Claire received funding for this program, and is there a possibility to relocate these funds to some of the alternative programs that Selika and Eric had mentioned at all?
Good question. Let me tell you, we haven't received a dime from the federal government yet. We don't know what the allocation will be. The HIDA is to target drug dealers, high-level drug dealers, in working in cooperation with Milwaukee HIDA and the HIDA out of Minneapolis. And to coordinate efforts analytically, we're going to take a look and try to identify those phone numbers. We grab onto cell phones and so forth. One of the things that Milwaukee HIDA does, and the Chief and I are going to talk about taking a look at it, the safe communities in Milwaukee, Safe and Sound, does get some money from the program. We don't know what our allocation is going to be. We're just newly identified. There were 48 grants put around the country that were submitted, and we were one of 14 that were identified. And part of the reason is the interstate coming through, and as Selika and I were talking about, some of the people that got arrested on the interstate were interstate traffickers of cocaine, methamphetamine, and just happened to be stopped in Eau Claire County. So again, you're not going to see much of a change of how our drug unit operates, but we'll keep the public informed. The Chief and I had talked about seeing if we can divert some money. We don't get much grant money any longer. We get about $88,000 for our drug task force for 14 agencies, federally funded. So a lot of the agencies are paying for their own officers' wages, but we're offsetting some of the other, the undercover cars and expenses that the drug unit has. But you're not going to see much of a change with our HIDA affiliation, except we're going to identify drug dealers going to federal court.
Yeah, so there's more to come on that in terms of practically how that's going to
It is. We're in the infancy of it, and we haven't had a long discussion with the HIDA from Milwaukee. So, again, we're going to find out from Safe and Sound of how they use their money in the community and how effective it is.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
Another question from David here. Sheriff Kramer, you brought up George Floyd's past, and you also brought up Derek Chauvin's past and said that there's more to the story. But what factors do you believe contribute to people of color not complying with law enforcement in some cases? And we can open this up to the whole panel. The second part of that is, where could law enforcement be at fault for inciting negative reactions from certain communities? And how can we maybe alleviate that moving forward?
There's going to be mistrust, as we've talked about. They've probably had some negative contacts in other communities. And again, it's for them to get to know us. The whole idea of community policing was have our officers work in the same neighborhood so the community got to know us. and we get to know them and the problems within their community. In the larger cities, unfortunately, if it's a high crime area, some of the new officers are placed into that area just because of seniority and some of those other things, whether right, wrong, or indifferent, and they have to try to mold themselves to the community. And that's one of the areas that federal government talked about of offsetting housing for some of the officers to live in the inner city so that they're really community-based officers.
I think, too, the community, you know, right now you don't have a right to self-defense. You don't have a right to self-defense if an officer is abusing you. Because the minute that you fight back, you have a resisting arrest or felony assault on an officer. So for somebody who is a multicultural person, it's a catch-22. If I comply, I may be killed. If I don't comply, I'll probably be killed. What am I going to do? And that's why you see some people run, because they just think all officers are going to shoot them, even if they haven't done anything. And they also fear, and I say this as a black Southerner, that they will not be believed. Some of my Hmong counterparts have talked about driving while Hmong, and there'd be an accident, and they would automatically be given the, they'd automatically be given the guilt for it, and they thought, and this was earlier when I came to Eau Claire in '93, they thought the officer didn't even listen to them. So there's a fear, especially when you're looking at an immigrant community where officers in other countries like Mexico really have been abusive and really have taken bribes and harassed people. The fear is that we won't be believed. The fear is that it doesn't matter what we're wearing. And you know, what do you have left to do? So it really does feel like this, because of this lack of trust, you're kind of, it's either side.
I think trust is the most important concept or statement in this in this conversation as well. To get back to Mr. Carlson's question, as far as the police role in inciting noncompliance, we really need to take it upon ourselves to build and strengthen that trust. And kind of the mantra that we have within our organization is that every contact, every interaction that we have with a community member, one way or the other, impacts trust with that community member, and probably every community member that person talks to about the interaction. And so we get to make a choice with every person that we interact with on whether we're going to move that trust needle the positive way and improve it, which we can do based on our body language, our demeanor, the words we choose, the decisions we make, whether we exhibit our community's values during that interaction. Do we treat that person with human dignity? Do we show them respect and compassion and our values? And that starts. It needs to start that way. We talked a little bit, or it was touched on a little earlier, about mistrust, not allowing for community members who are aggrieved to feel comfortable to come forward and complain about the actions of a police officer, and that's a real thing. And so we have it on our website. There's a link to make an online citizen report. We're pointed to point the persons in the direction of the Police and Fire Commission where they can make a complaint. That person's not going to do that if they don't trust the process and don't trust the institutions that do that. And so we do. So in response to the question, we as a police department and police officers, we have a responsibility to build that trust and do that and create that environment where we hopefully have trust to start with, but if there's a mistake or a problem or something that needs to be aggrieved, or a person's aggrieved or needs to be investigated, that there's confidence in our system where there can be the proper follow-up, the proper investigation, the proper outcomes for that. So it's on us.
I think it's important, too, to mention that Selika Ducksworth-Lawton is on the Fire and Commission Board.
Yep.
So, like, if you talk about our Fire and Police Commission, and so if there's a process in place where if you have a grief to bring against whoever, I know that she will not just ignore that, and I doubt the rest of the commission would as well. And so that's one of those things where, like, you talk about building trust. That's, I think, a great avenue for building trust when you're talking about, I feel like I was mistreated in some way by a police officer. Where do I go? Go to the Fire and Police Commission, share with them, and then you'll be protected fundamentally. I think that's what people need to know.
Yes.
Is that they can be safe if they engage in that kind of conversation or criticism or whatever, however you would frame it up.
The Police and Fire Commission here really is essentially not corrupt. And I mean, I'm ending my first year on it. The Milwaukee Police and Fire Commission is a whole different day's animal. And I think, it's interesting because people here I know that I didn't realize there was a Police and Fire Commission until 2009, 2010, when I was working with Jerry Matisick, and he was implementing evidence-based policing in and the critical intervention theory. And I'm like, what? Do you guys advertise it? And no, it wasn't really advertised. And I really wish there was a way we could advertise that this is here so that people would know. One of the reasons why I agreed to join was because Uniting Bridges would get these reports, and then I'd wind up having to feed them up. And Jerry Matisick, I think, Jerry Stanishewski was probably getting sick of having me call him. It's going to be easier to put me on the Police and Fire Commission and just have me do this than having me email and buzz his cell phone on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So
we have some more great questions, and I want to keep rolling through some of these. So Adam, would you?
Yeah, sure thing. So the next question is about qualified immunity. What are your thoughts as panelists on ending qualified immunity? And currently, how are you keeping your officers accountable in situations where they've been reported as having misconduct in a certain situation?
Oh, I can dive on that. For qualified immunity, I think there's a misunderstanding of really what that is and what it does. Qualified immunity does not prevent a district attorney from applying criminal charges against an officer who engages in misconduct of office or excessive force. All qualified immunity really does would protect that individual officer from being sued personally if they acted appropriately under the color of law. If you did not act appropriately under cover of law, let's just use Derek Chauvin for an example, he is not going to receive qualified immunity for that. I don't see how he would. He violated Fourth Amendment rights, which is a Section 1983 violation in the federal code. And in all likelihood, he'll be charged, go to prison for that on the federal level, not just on what a potential local district attorney could do on the state level. Qualified immunity was something that falls, under the lines of Police and Fire Commission, of why those were created, those civil service commissions, following the political period of the United States in policing, when policing was so corrupt and tied to political machines that the country at that time and states felt that they needed to find ways to ensure that officers can make good decisions, like if the mayor's son had to be arrested, they could be arrested, and the officer did not have to worry about being fired. And that's where those civil service commissions came into play, is to protect that. So as far as I see it, the qualified immunity is not what's preventing people from being charged. It's preventing the frivolous lawsuits that will come into play from people. Now, if people have a legitimate lawsuit, they're in all likelihood going to make some hay on it. And I don't think there are that many departments, especially the ones here in the Chippewa Valley. If officers here are engaging in misconduct, we're not going to keep them around. There's just far too much at stake. And you get to this resisting arrest, it is that trust piece. And we cannot keep people around that are violating that trust and engaging in that misconduct. But we also need to protect people that are doing the right thing and doing a good job. Because if you're going to ask people to choose between their family or their job, they're going to end up not wanting to do this job and do something else to prevent that from the family. And I worry, again, with those conversations that we're going to be making some changes in laws that are going to have unintended consequences. And there's a lot of misunderstanding to qualified immunity, at least in my opinion. I don't know if the panelists here feel differently or otherwise.
Yeah, and just a couple thoughts on that, because I think there's a couple concepts there to unpack. There's the policy and oversight and accountability, which is a big piece for that, and part of the federal conversation on qualified immunity that we've picked up on in the last couple of weeks is making police officers personally liable for through a civil suit for any alleged misconduct. And I think we all are in agreement here as chief executives, our support for that accountability, that oversight for our officers. They need to be compliant. They need to do the right thing. One thing I'm concerned about with the personal liability part of that discussion is having an environment, at least here locally, where we have quality people interested in being police officers. We really need to have an environment where we have people with the right public service mindset, who are caring, good communication skills, problem solvers, who are motivated to contribute to their community as police officers. Our success or failure is going to be in part, as a police organization, is going to be in part by the quality of people that we can recruit to that vital role as being a police officer. So right now, as a profession, policing is struggling in recruiting numbers and our candidates, and we're seeing it on interview day. Those numbers are down. And so having that supportive environment where people want to be part of that is important. When it comes to the accountability piece, and this isn't to say that the Eau Claire Police Department's perfect. We have more work to do. We're committed to continual reforms, but it starts by what I said, bringing the right person into the organization to start with, having good policies and having compliance with those policies. We use Lexipol for our policy management system, and so Lexipol, that's a service that we work with, that's put together by it's a consortium of national recognized experts in the field of policing, a multidisciplinary group of experts. And so they provide us with model best practices that we use. Our policy manual is updated twice every year to make sure that it stays current. And then our officers are tested monthly on our policies. They take a written test every month to not only make sure that they know our policies, that they understand them, but additionally can apply them in real-life practical situations. And so that's part of the way that we do that. There's other pieces to that accountability as well. There's a huge area of focus right now on body cameras when it comes to police officers. And as an accountability piece, we're taking the steps as a local community that we've accelerated our implementation of body cameras for that. A lot of times, if a camera catches misconduct, it's too late because it already happened. And so we want to create that culture and that environment where it doesn't happen in the first place. But, the camera systems are an important tool. That's one of the things that they will do to add to it. So we have a quality assurance program to make sure that our officers are turning their camera systems on. So our supervisors are required to review a certain percentage of our officers' incidents to make sure that they turn their camera system on, and then also to watch the footage to see what the officer did, what he or she did. And it's not necessarily always just to create a potential disciplinary situation, but there's training and coaching and learned experience that the officers can get from that. And so you need, bringing the right people in, having that environment where you have that culture, and then the policy and oversight pieces, and then having the systems in place to make sure that we're following those rules. And the camera is one of several examples of how we need to do that.
I think Selika's got something in mind.
Well, federal qualified immunity and state qualified immunity are two separate animals. And the federal law that you actually, Eric, were referring to, I teach it as the Second Ku Klux Klan Act, that if you commit, a crime under color of office, you violate someone's rights, et cetera. The problem, the state level still really has a workable qualified immunity where there is a standard that people can meet. The problem is at the federal level, the Supreme Court has issued this series of conflicting rulings that has made it almost impossible to meet the threshold, because you would have to have an incident that is so perfectly encapsulated in the previous law to meet it. So right now, when we're talking about qualified immunity reform, It really needs to be at the federal level. But we do need to be careful with the way we do it because we don't want to disincentive police officers. What some communities have found is that the police's insurance companies have forced them to fire rogue officers. Once an officer has 3 or 4 or 5 violations, the insurance companies have forced them to be fired because they cost too much. And that may be the road we see some of this turning towards. In that, because as long as it's taxpayer money paying out the paying out for these bad behaviors, there's no real incentive. It's a perverse incentive. But those insurance premiums evidently are not a perverse incentive. When you see Alabama actually firing people, that's pretty powerful. And I give way to Ron, because you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I think there is a lot of misconceptions on the qualified immunity, and I agree with the chief that if they go too far, we will have a problem recruiting people. We see it in our correction facility right now. Is we're having a hard time getting correctional officers to do that job, to live within the walls with some of the people that are our most problematic people in the community 24/7. They get threatened just like the officers out in the street do. When I get out, I'm coming after you and your family. That's concerning to us in our community, because it's not too hard to figure out where some of the officers live because they have their name. A lot of our correctional officers wanted the name taken off their uniform because they were being threatened by certain individuals. So again, policing is a tough job, and corrections is a tough job, and we certainly want to recruit, like the chief said, the right people and retain the right people. And just talking about this, Selika brought up about Louisiana. At the height of their corruption, they're paying their police officers $13,000 a year back in the 1980s. So a lot of those police officers had second jobs or were taking money for traffic tickets because they weren't paying them an adequate salary. And so, again, we got to make sure that we're getting the right people, we pay and retain the right people along the way. And, you know, like I said, I'm proud that we live in this community, that we can have these discussions. And, yep, I have people call me up that have loved ones in the jail and want to give me some criticism, and we'll check into each one of the cases. But the importance is that we get back to them and we talk to them. Most of it's because the person's an adult, it's a medical issue, and unless they sign a HIPAA release. So we have to go through some of those things and train some of the people. There's certain things we can talk to you about and certain things we can't, especially if they're under a criminal arrest and the case is still pending. So again, I just appreciate this conversation.
We one of the things I think about, because as I listen to you three, I really, the picture that you're painting sounds good, you know, and I can say from my personal experience with policing in this area that, you know, I've never had a negative experience, and I don't believe my son's ever had a negative experience. I mean, he's only 11, but hopefully he doesn't have a whole lot of experience with the police as time goes on, just generally speaking. But how do we reconcile dynamics like, you know, we've talked about the extreme case of Derek Chauvin over in Minneapolis. We look at, you know, the killers, the police officers who killed Breonna Taylor in Louisville. So another really ugly situation, and there doesn't seem to be any real accountability happening around that. I think at the heart of the question about the qualified immunity is accountability. I think that's the key
For sure.
thing that people are asking about with that. And, you know, it feels like, and again, I say it feels like, but it feels like there are countless stories of police officers killing somebody. I'll just say somebody. I'm not going to say even a black person, but somebody. But specifically, it seems more visible when it's a black person, and there are no ramifications. in terms of like actual jail time when it's inappropriate. I mean, obviously there are things that are done in the line of duty that the police officer felt like they had to do. Then there are other times where there's obvious misconduct and it feels like there's no real accountability. And so, like, the picture that we're painting here of Eau Claire and Menominee in the Chippewa Valley is, well, we don't want those people as a part of our department, which I'm with you. I don't want them either. But, you know, like, the picture you're painting of there being accountability, like the kind of accountability you guys are talking about, is far different than what we have seen throughout the United States in various other contexts. And so for me, that's a little bit of I don't know how to make those things work together, other than I know there are contextual differences, you know, in different locations. But it's how so for somebody who comes from, you know, if somebody comes from a community where black people were mistreated by the police on a regular basis, you know. I have a pastor friend who told me stories about growing up in Chicago and just consistently being harassed by the police in his neighborhood. How do we help those folks that have that kind of experience reconcile what we hear outside of this area with what we're saying we're going to do in this area? Is that a fair question?
I think it's a very fair question. First things first, it's incumbent upon the leaders of the agencies, whether it's a sheriff's office or a police department, to meet with those community members. I've heard people say, well, people just need to understand what the police do and figure that out. I couldn't disagree more with that thought pattern. We're public servants. We work for the public. We work for everyone that's in our community. So you need to create a culture inside of your organization of meeting with different community stakeholders or shareholders or whatever term you want to put it, those individual neighborhoods, and having meaningful conversations and then listening to their experiences, their perceptions, what they want from their police, how they want to be policed. There was a mention of the community policing. Community policing is working collaboratively with a community to identify problems and solve them together. Not the police telling you how we're going to solve a problem and then you're going to just live with what we do, but it's working together. And so in those communities where you don't have that kind of trust, whether it's a city the size of Menominee or Eau Claire or a county of Eau Claire, or you're going all the way up to a New York City, you need to create that culture within the department to work with the communities, understand that not everybody's going to agree with you. You need to listen to that. You need to work together to create programs, systems for change that impact people and help them be policed the way they want to be policed. And that is really no different than the original mission of professional policing from 1829. We need to go back to those days and understand that that is where we have to work with the community. That'll start building that trust, that legitimacy, because whether they've had a bad experience or it's been passed on generationally or hearing from it, and then the constant bombardment on like media, social media of these images, it's overwhelming to people. And if you're from those communities in particular, the amount of trauma and anxiety it creates is tremendous. And we fear what we do not know. And how is anybody ever going to be able to trust law enforcement if we don't take the first step to go in there and have an interaction that's non-confrontational manner and build relationships? That has to be how it is, and it's incumbent upon police to do it. And it needs to be the leaders in those communities, leaders of those departments, to make that happen. And you talk about the accountability. If they are not doing it, those leaders are the ones that need to go. They really do, because it's on us. It really is. You start doing that, then you're going to start seeing officers and change starting to take place from small agencies to large. But it has to be a truly dedicated effort to do that. Not lip service, but really doing that and giving people that time, giving them that dignity, giving them a voice. and then working with that, being fair and transparent in those objectives and conversations.
Thank you so much. So I have to tell you guys, it's 8:55. We've just scratched several surfaces. But we need to start transitioning because people, are probably getting tired. And so, but what we want to do, one of the things that we like to do every week, we've only done it twice. But we want to do it every week is to have a call to action. And I feel like in light of what Eric was just saying and what we've been talking about all night, this call to action feels like it is very pertinent. And that's to lean in. The call to action is to lean in and not away from these conversations, and to have these conversations with the people with whom you need to have these conversations. So reach out to your local law enforcement officers and entities. Make connections with them. Again, I appreciate what Eric was just saying in terms of it's really incumbent upon the police officers to get out into the community and make those positive connections. But the community can do that too, and we can advocate for each other, and we can. But there has to be a leaning in and not away, and that whole idea of community partnership is super duper important. And so my invitation to you, as you're listening to this or watching us, is that you would lean in and not away from these conversations. And I want to take a moment to thank several entities and people for being a part of Conversations in Color. The Pablo Center, just a great partner in this whole thing. Thank you, Pablo Center. Thank you, Uniting Bridges. Thank you, Converge Radio. And I want to thank our panelists tonight. Thank you so much, Sheriff Ron Cramer, Chief Matt Rokus, Chief Eric Atkinson. Thank you so much for being here. As always, thank you, Selika, for being a part of this. Next week, we're diving into something else. We're going to talk about those pesky monuments and what we should be doing with them. So that is, we're going to talk about, all those Confederate monuments and monuments to Columbus and all that stuff and how we should respond to all that. And we're going to have Dr. Latrice Donaldson and Dr. Cheryl Jimenez-Fry to be a part of that with us as well. So looking forward to that. And want to just kind of close out with just some thoughts about this whole Defund the Police thing. So Defund the Police is a catchphrase. It's a hashtag. And I can totally and completely understand why it would be something that people would want to grab onto and make a rallying cry. But as it is with any catchphrase, it's kind of a mixed bag. It is. It doesn't matter how much truth is conveyed in that catchphrase. A catchphrase will never be able to capture all of the context and nuance of a situation as complex as when we talk about policing and systemic issues and all those things that we're trying to talk about right now. And obviously this Defund the Police hashtag or catchphrase has come into prominence in the wake of George Floyd's murder. It makes sense, and it carries with it a necessary message that we need to pay attention to, that we need to take a look at policing, and we need to take a hard, long look at whatever systemic problems there may be in policing and cultural problems in policing. We need to take a look at those things. But we also need to be honest about the fact that the emotion that such a catchphrase can carry with it and the emotion that drives us to be drawn to it can sometimes distract us from the nuance and the complexity of what's actually true. This whole issue is complicated. It's not simple. And I think for a lot of us, we like to default to black and white and good and evil, and that's just easy, right? It's easy intellectually, it's easy emotionally. Let's pick a side, and we can vilify the other side, and that makes us feel good about life, makes us feel more comfortable. It's just easy. But in order for us to really move forward together when it comes to whatever reforms need to happen in policing, whatever we need to move forward with in terms of defunding the police, whatever that looks like, we have to pay attention to the context and to the nuance. We have to lean in. We have to ask hard questions. And when it makes sense to defund the police department because of fundamental corruption or targeting of people of color, those things are unacceptable. And it doesn't matter whether the the targeting of people of color is intentional or not, or if it's just the result of a policy that has systemic racism overtones or underlying dynamics to it. It doesn't matter. Those things are unacceptable, and we need to talk about potentially defunding. In such cases, drastic changes are needed. But not all police entities need to be defunded. I look at the conversations, the few conversations I've had with Chief Rokus, Chief Matt Rokus here with the Eau Claire PD, and my experience with the Eau Claire PD since the murder of George Floyd. And I see in them humility. I see in them the desire to be better. Even though we don't have egregious stories of things that have happened here with the Eau Claire Police. But I hear from them a desire to be better, to grow. And then I've seen very practically in the protests and the rallies that I've been a part of, they have been a partner in those things with us as we have stood up against the injustice against George Floyd and against other people of color at the hands of the police. And so for me, I don't want to defund the Eau Claire Police. I want to build on the good stuff that's there. And so there are some, yes, that need to be defunded, some programs that need to be defunded. Some need to be fundamentally rebuilt and reimagined. But it's not as simple as we want it to be. And it's going to take us work to really lean in and to dig in to figure out where the changes need to happen, where the conversations need to happen, and where things just need to be overhauled from the beginning. Well, I want to thank you for being a part of Conversations in Color. It's been a good night. I'm tired. I'm sure these guys are tired, and we all need to go home and get some rest. Thank you so much. Please join us again next week at 7:30 on Converge Radio 99.9 or on the Pablo Center's live streaming platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.